In this final class of the series, we explore the Rebbe's comments about Israel's lopsided hostage deals during the late 1970s and 1980s, alongside the perspective of other poskim during that period. Okay, today we're doing part 4 of hostages. And we're going to begin tonight's story in the year 1979. On Friday, May 25th of 1979, Israeli forces pulled out of the city of Arish, which is in the Sinai Desert. And this was the first withdrawal that happened as a result of the Camp David Accords, which were signed in March of 1979. And so the first movement of Israeli troops where they pull out and Egyptian troops take over occurs on Friday, May 25, 1979. It was Erev Shabbos, Parshas Bamidbar. Motzei Shabbos, the Rebbe Fabreng, those were the years when the Rebbe was Fabrenging instead of Shabbos afternoon, Motzei Shabbos. And so what the Rebbe said could actually be captured, can be heard in the audio. Motzei Shabbos, the Rebbe spoke a sicha about the travesty of the Camp David Accords. Now is not the time and place to get into the Rebbe's views on that matter. But this was the subject matter, and you could understand why the Rebbe is talking about it, because literally the first movement of Israeli troops where they pulled out of an Egyptian city happened the Friday before. And as the Rebbe was talking about the mistake of Camp David, the Rebbe then mentioned what appears to be derech agav. The Rebbe mentioned another point. And the Rebbe said as follows. Now we have another very disturbing incident that has occurred. There was a Jew who was captured. His name was Avraham Amram. He was an Israeli soldier who was captured in April of 1978. There was a Mivtza Litani in Lebanon that was happening at the time. And this Israeli soldier was captured by Palestinian terrorists. And that happened in April of 1978. March of 1979, so almost a year later, he was released in exchange for 76 prisoners from Israeli prisons. As the Rebbe says, some 70 or so from the other side. The number was 76. Now again, this happened in March. The Rebbe didn't say anything, but now that the Rebbe in May is talking about Camp David, the Rebbe adds this into the equation. When America, this happened at the same time that America made a deal with Russia. America made a deal with Russia in April of 1978, where there was an exchange made of 2 for 5. Basically, there were 2 Russian citizens caught in America spying for Russia. So they were incarcerated here. And America was trying to get people who were refuseniks. Some of them were refuseniks, others were political prisoners in Russia. So that actually all 5 people in this deal are Russian citizens. It's not like there's Russians for Americans. But there were 3, what's the number that I would say here? 5. There were 5 people in Russian jails, Russian citizens, human rights activists. 3 of them were Jewish. Some of them were involved in trying to hijack a plane in 1970 to escape Russia, to get to Eretz Yisrael. And these 5 were released in exchange for the Russians getting the 2 who were arrested here in New York for espionage. So the Rebbe is pointing to that and said, here you had a deal of 2 for 5, und da men ausgebitten einem of etlich und 70, and here the deal was 1 for 76. Now the Rebbe says very interesting words. MS Taka, you could already understand where this is going. Generally speaking, the the Rebbe's language is going to be criticizing this deal. And you already see that right now. But then immediately the Rebbe says the following. If you're going to ask the question halachically, then you can argue. What? What's the argument? Because here we're dealing with the life of one Jew. Even if you need to give so many more, art, there's place, that we should argue in them how the din is supposed to be. In simple English, what does the Rebbe seem to be saying? If you want to get into halachic discussion about whether this deal was mutter or not, you can have an argument about it. What's the argument? So we already saw. We saw the argument in the previous, last class we saw it. We saw it in the previous classes as well. One of the classic discussions we saw was, we say that you're not allowed to overpay, but does Pikuach Nefesh suspend that? And we saw Tosa said Pikuach Nefesh suspends that, and we saw the Marshal saying Pikuach Nefesh suspends it. We saw differing views. We saw the Ramban saying Nishtasa. So you see that it's a debate. So the Rebbe said, if you want to have that halachic debate, you could have that halachic debate. But the Rebbe said, so let's put that aside. And I want to criticize this not from that perspective, but from other perspectives. And then the Rebbe continues to say the following. I asked, people are asking. Unfortunately, the reality is that the taking of hostages happened before 1979. And it happened numerous times. And you yourself, I'll paraphrase now, as I look at the Yiddish, I'll just read it in English. And you yourself, meaning the Israeli government themselves, have said that this is a fundamental principle, Nekuda Ikris, that we're not giving into terror. The Rebbe is referring to the fact that we saw last week, the 1970 incident. Israel said, no, not talking. 1972, Munich, during that standoff. There was also a demand there for a release. What did Israel say? No, not happening. In Ma'alot, in 1974, also where real terrible incident. They also made demands. Israel said no. And Tebi, 1976. So time and again, and there were other events as well during this period, definitely during the 1970s, where the Israeli government is saying no and no and no and no. And with a reason. And it's a reason, was hat an art and halacha. Makes sense in halacha, the reason that Israel said no. And it has an art in seichel hapashut, why Israel said no. And it has an art in diplomatia. And the Rebbe adds interesting words. This is what they're building on now. In other words, the Rebbe saw the Camp David Accords as a real shift in terms of how Israel is positioning itself vis-a-vis the world. That now we're building the sustainability of Israel on diplomacy. So even in the world of diplomacy, refusing to give in to the demands of the terrorists makes sense. So halacha, seichel hapashut, and diplomacy. Why? Because if you're going to show them that through threats you're going to let out the people that they want out, in other words, their threats are being effective, so vetas megara sein, this itself is going to elicit as their fires now they're going to look for more hostages because they see it as a good payoff. So there's no choice that and that we have to show them that it's not effective. This has been the position of the Israeli government for numerous years. And there are Jews who died because of this policy, because we could have got them out in these some of these earlier incidents that I referenced earlier. And all of a sudden now that you made an about face. Why? Why are you changing your policy? You had a policy that made sense. Why are you changing your policy? Now remember, the Rebbe said, halacha, you can have an argument, but we're not getting into that right now. I have a different question. We had a policy that made sense in halacha, it made sense in seichel hapashut, it has a makim in halacha, it has a makim in seichel hapashut, and it has an art in diplomacy, and now all of a sudden we changed. What happened? Why we changed right now? That's number one, the Rebbe said. And that, the Rebbe went on to say, is true even before we found out who these 76 were. In other words, the very fact that a number of people were released, before we find out what their resumes are, why they were sitting in jail, I already have this critique of why did you change. How much more so when we find out what happened. It took a few days until it became public information who these 76 people were. Before the politicians realized that the truth is eventually going to come out. And now the truth came out. What's the truth? That amongst these 76, about half of them are there in Beis Asurim, not because of Inyanim Shalma Bekach. They're not there for nothing. In other words, there's different levels of crime, and there's people who literally commit murder, and then there's aiding and abetting or whatever it is. Half of the people who are there, to use the language they use today, have blood on their hands. The Rebbe then adds, even when it came to people who are there for more minor issues, still, all the years till now, there was, we don't give in to threats, we don't give in to terror. But now, we found out that in addition to letting those people out, they also let about half, literal lives were lost because of directly from these people. Also, you would say that maybe these people are going to change their ways because of the fact that they sat in prison and they realize it's not effective. No! They don't say that they're doing tshuva. These are people who say that they're not changing their ways. Why? Because the terrorists, they view that their cause is righteous. They think they're right. And then the Rebbe added these very ominous words. Rahman al-Itzlan, hoya loisia, mizet nit kein sibba, farvaz ezal and zich nit mishtadel sein noch einmal. Al pidarach hatava, there is no, I don't see, we don't see a reason why these half of the 76 shouldn't try again. So in other words, right here, you have two critiques. One critique is, why did you change your policy? And number two is, how are we letting out people with blood on their hands who al pitava, they're going to go right back to do this, to doing this work. But remember, the Rebbe began the discussion by saying that if you want to have a diyan and halacha, then there's room for it, right? So at the end, the Rebbe comes back and repeats that again. And the response, as es ken zayin, as to ein idin, darf man azoy ton al pi Shulchan Aruch, to save a life. So Shulchan Aruch demands that this is something that we need to do. So the Rebbe says, nit das is given der tam, was mal das getan. That wasn't their justification. That wasn't the reason. Right? They're not looking to halacha and making the policy based on halacha. The reason, in fact, not only it wasn't halacha, it was something else. The tam is given, das is a chelek, von a ganze shitta, this is part of an entire perspective, and the shitta is, this methodology is the hepech von va'oilech eschem kaimemius. The opposite of being proud of being strong. Right? Va'oilech eschem kaimemius is a pasuk, is lashon of a pasuk. And kaimemius, the way is standing upright, is strong, it's a strong posture. The hepech of va'oilech eschem kaimemius, in other words, we've become very dovish, and that is the current posture right now. And that's the reason this was done, which would explain the Rebbe's rhetorical question. Why did you change? Why did you change? You changed. The reason you changed is because you're in a matziv, you're in a situation of the hepech of ha'oilech eschem kaimemius. And because we moved into a zone of the hepech of ha'oilech eschem kaimemius, that's why we're doing what we're doing. In other words, if we were dealing with the reality that someone made a best faith effort to know what halacha said in this case. And they went to their Rav, and they asked the Shaila, and the Rav told them this. Okay, maybe I could live in that world. That's what it sounds like the Rebbe saying. I could live in that world. But that's not what happened here. That's not what's happening over here. What happened over here is a shitta that's the opposite of strength, and this is what's happening here right now, and hence the criticism that you have in the Sikha. It leads to a very interesting place, this sikha from Bamidbar Lamed Tes. Because on the one hand, if you look at the overall tone and the words of the sikha, there's no doubt that the Rebbe is criticizing this deal. The Rebbe is not happy with this deal. And in fact, the Rebbe sees it as a symptom of a much larger problem. And that's why it's part of a Camp David sikha. In other words, the Rebbe is criticizing the Camp David Accords, and along the way he says, which as the Rebbe established this, the reason this deal happened is because it's coming from that same incorrect position and posture. But then at the same time, along the way, we have the Rebbe saying not once but twice, by the way, in halacha, there's a possibility that this could be mutter. And in terms of the halachic arguments, we saw that in the previous year. We saw, yes, there's a limitation in gittin, but we saw maybe B'koach Nefesh pushes off those limitations. We had a discussion last time, what about putting people in sakana? What about the fact that you're putting people in sakana? And the Rebbe himself in this sikha mentioned that I don't see a reason why they shouldn't zich mishtadel zayin nachama. In other words, the Rebbe is aware of the fact that these people were going to be putting people in sakana. And yet, right after that, the Rebbe said, by the way, there's still a tain al pi shulchan aruch that is mutter. So in other words, that forces us to go back to what we spoke about in the previous class, where once nishtazoi pashat. If you remember, maybe it's mutter to enter a sakana to save someone, even if it's not a chiyuv, maybe at least it's mutter. We also spoke about Rabbi Vadia Yosef, mentioned the idea that a third party, if you regard yourself as a third party, so then you're allowed to choose to save the vada, even if it means introducing suffix for other people. Or maybe there's another reason, I don't know. But it seems that even after assuming the danger to others, the Rebbe is still asserting that there's a possibility and there's an avenue here to say that this is mutter. This is the Sikha from Bamidbar Tov Shin Lamed Tes. Now I want to show you something very interesting. In Tov Shin Mem, 1980, Rabbi Shalom Doisber Volpe in Eretz Yisrael put out a work called Das Torah B'Inyonei Hamatzav B'Eretz HaKodesh, the Torah's position on the situation in Eretz Yisrael. And the purpose of this book was to take the many sikhs of the Rebbe about Eretz Yisrael, about Camp David, about territory, about Pikuach Nefesh, about Siman Shin Chav Tes in Shulchan Aruch, and to write it out in a systematic way, and that's the book that he did, that he authored at the time. Now I need to say that generally this book is very highly regarded. In other words, it is seen as accurately, I'm not saying it's a perfect book, but I think generally the consensus of those who know this field say that he accurately portrayed the Rebbe's positions on the matters of Eretz Yisrael. However, there's a footnote over there that caught my attention. On page 97, footnote number 5. What happens here, on that page, on page 97, he reaches a place where he's summarizing this Sikha of Bamidbar Lamed Tes. He summarized. And what he does is, in the body, on the page itself, he has all the points of critique. The Russians only gave, the Americans gave 2, and the Russians gave 5. Right? So it's a more symmetrical type of deal. So he has that. Why did you change? It's because you don't have the position of Ha'ilech Eschem Kaimemius anymore. There are people who have blood on their hands. Why would they not continue doing that? All those points are in the actual page, on page 97. What's missing there is where the Rebbe says twice that you could have a discussion al pi halacha, whether this is mutter, it's not there, it's not on the page. Instead, it's in a footnote. Now it's in a footnote, and he words it the following way. Let's read this really closely. He writes like this. V'hinei, lulei hanasivos hamyuchados yeshnam kan, were it not for the unique circumstances that are here, in our case, in Israel, hayamakom ladon be'inyan mibchina halachtis, we would then have the possibility of discussing this from a halachic perspective. Why? Because man, there's known that there's a whole give and take on the sugi of overpaying for captives. That the poskim write that you're not allowed to overpay zarak b'meim. That's only in the earlier days when the captives were sold as slaves. But it doesn't apply when it's sakanas nefashos. Because in the case of sakanas nefashos, ein gvul v'kitchol b'koach nefesh. If it's sakanas nefashos, then there's no financial limit. You pay anything. Says Rabbi Volpav, kol zeh, all of this is kishem mevakshim mamim b'chtei l'shachar shuim, if you only want money. Mashen ken kan, however, over here, sheshichru ha'machablim tmuras ha'shavoi, where instead, to get the shavoi, to get Reb Amram back, they gave up terrorists. So now, what do you mean? Now you're causing a pikuach nefesh problem. Because these machablim are saying that they're going to continue with, sorry for the typo there, with ma'aseh chabala shalem. And so therefore, what's he saying? Rav Volpa is saying he's learning Pshat in the Sikha. What's he learning Pshat in the Sikha? He's learning Pshat in the Sikha like this. That the Rebbe is saying that this deal is bad and is usher and is not allowed. However, the Rebbe mentioned that Achagav, that by the way, if we were living in other times, so then because it's Pikuach Nefesh, so there would be a theoretical discussion about, maybe you're allowed to give a lot of money. But because we're not living in a circumstance where it's money, and because we're talking about terror, so therefore it's completely usher. Okay, I think this is a very difficult thing to say that the Rebbe meant. I don't see that in the Sikha. The Rebbe is talking about 1979. He's not talking about earlier times. The Rebbe is talking about releasing terrorists. The Rebbe is not talking about money. And Alpha became, the Rebbe said that there's room in halacha to have this discussion. What Rabbi Revolpa did is he's learning, the Rebbe is saying this as, if it were a case of where we needed to give a lot of money, so then we can have a discussion. I think this is very difficult. Again, I don't know why Rabbi Volpa wrote this. I don't know what led him to this. And I don't know the Rebbe's position on Shlemas Haaretz and etc. the way he does. But this particular footnote over here is very difficult when you see the Sikha overall. And it's only going to be strengthened by what we're going to see later on. I'll also say another point here. 2 years ago, right after October 7th, there was a video posted online. It's on a YouTube channel called Liris Malkeinu. Liris Malkeinu created a video of this Sikha. Now obviously there's no video footage, just audio, but they pan over an image and they have the summary of this Sikha Bamidbar Tashel Amates. It gives the Rebbe's position on these hostage exchanges. And these 2 times that the Rebbe says that in halacha you could have a discussion are omitted from the thing. They're not there. So all you hear is the critique without the Rebbe having said once in the beginning and once at the end that there's room in halacha to have this discussion. Which I think leads me to say that when people look at the Sikha, I don't know that people know exactly how to handle what the Rebbe is saying here. Like, if we don't like the deal, so we don't like it. Why are we saying we don't like it, but by the way, there's room in halacha? I think that leads a little bit to a certain dissonance in the mind of not having a very black and white position. And again, Rabbi Volpa dealt with that his way by framing the Rebbe's theoretical din in halacha to, if it would have been a monetary conversation of giving non-terrorists money, then maybe, that's where we would end up having the conversation about overpaying. And the way Liris Malkeinu seemed to deal with it is just omit it from the conversation. I'm not a big expert on this subject, but I don't know. I think that there's a little more nuance that needs to be brought into this discussion, and this is going to repeat itself as we're going to see as we move into the 1980s, which we're going to do now. So now let's move into 1980s. September 4, 1982, there were 8 Israeli soldiers who were captured once again by Palestinian terrorists in Lebanon. This is during the Lebanon War. And on 23rd of November 1983, so in other words, the beginning of Tafshin Mem Dalet, they were exchanged. 6 of them were released, 2 of them remained in captivity. 6 of them were released for 4,598 Palestinians who were in Israeli prisons. So that's a whopping number. This again occurred 23rd November 1983. A few days later, December 3rd, 1983, which happens to be the day I was born, the Rebbe spoke about this in the Farbrengen of Shabbos Parshas Miketz Tov Shin Mem Dalet. Here is the paragraph from the Yiddish Hanacha of the Sikha. Again, here it's Shabbos, so I can't say we have the exact words, but more or less. The Rebbe said, the Rebbe was talking about how he was very unhappy with the way the Israeli government was executing the war in Lebanon. So it's a Sikha about the Lebanon war, how it has to be executed swiftly and correctly. And then along the way the Rebbe said, I'm not talking about the fact that we just have exchanged thousands of Palestinians for 6 Jews. Das ist doch nur am Subov davon, because this whole exchange is only a symptom, because they didn't expedite the war, and they didn't execute the war properly, and they didn't finish the war properly. And so as a result of that, you ended up having where they came and they took Israeli captives. So the Rebbe used these words, the beginning was a pshia, and then the end was a oinus. In other words, the Rebbe is viewing the hostage deal as an oinus. But it was tchilasa b'pshia because you didn't execute the war the way you were supposed to. You didn't expel all of the terrorists from that area. And so then, that was the tchilasa b'pshia. So there are so many different outcomes, including this one. This is what the Rebbe said. Now, what's really interesting about this, there's no mention of halacha whatsoever. But what you do have here is this very interesting language of where the Rebbe says that he's viewing this deal as an oinus. It almost sounds like, I understand why the deal happened, it's inevitable. The Rebbe does not condemn the deal itself. the Rebbe condemns the Tchilas b'Pshia that led to the fact that we needed to make this deal. But once we reached the place where the deal needed to be made, the Rebbe, in this Sikha, the Yiddish Hanacha says this, the Hebrew Hanacha says this, Tchilas b'Pshia v'Seifa b'Ainas. So here the Rebbe had another opportunity to say, hey, there was a deal and it was usher. The Rebbe didn't say there was a deal and it was usher. In fact, here the Rebbe doesn't even condemn the deal per se, but condemns what led to it. That was instance number 2, reference number 2 that we have from the Rebbe on this subject. Now I said there were only 6 that were released. Those remaining 2 who were captured in September 1982 were finally released in May of 1985. This is one of the most famous deals that Israel did. It's called Iskat Jibril. And this was done on the 21st of May, 1985. For these 2 remaining Israeli soldiers and one other that they had, were released for 1,150. And here already, I think you could start seeing a change in Israel. And the change is that suddenly in the mid-80s, you start to have Rabbanim who say, we don't like this. There's a problem here. And I want to remind you that last class, if I recall correctly, the only one who said, hey, this is no good, were 2 American rabbis. I mean, Rabbi Gershuni was in America when he wrote his piece, and Rabbi Kamenetsky was also in America. And I think all the Israeli Rabbanim, if I recall correctly, they were okay with it. Rabbi Shol Yisraeli, we had another one who was speaking during the 1970s, they were okay with it. What happens in the mid-1980s, around the time after this Jibril deal is done in May of 1985, you start having Israeli Rabbanim coming out publicly and saying, oh, this is a problem. So, for example, Rabbi Shlomo Goren. Rabbi Shlomo Goren is a very significant name. He was at the time the chief rabbi, not at this time, not in Tavshin Mem Hey. But he was the chief rabbi. And he wrote an article in Hatzoifa, which is a religious Zionist newspaper, Yud Aleph Sivan, May 30th. So, 9 days after the deal. And he says like this, I know there are poskim that say that if it's pikuach nefesh, you're allowed to overpay. His analysis is that Roiv poskim don't agree with that. I don't know exactly, we're not going to get into how he counts. Most poskim don't agree with that. And even when it's pikuach nefesh, you're not allowed to overpay, he says. That's what the takana of the chacham was. The takana of the chachamim was, ein poidin, even if it means pikuach nefesh for those who are going to suffer as a result. Then he said, but at the end of the day, I have to admit, there are those poskim who said, Toisves, that if it's pikuach nefesh, you could overpay. He said, moreover, it appears to me that even according to the position of Toisves, that holds that if there is a threat to life to the captives, then you're allowed to overpay. They will admit in our case here in Israel in the 1980s, that we're not allowed to make these exchanges. Why? Because we're in a situation of war with these terror organizations. And it is very clear that freeing these murderers in such high numbers is going to increase terrorism. And it's going to expand their reach and their abilities to hurt Israel and in all other places around the world. And so therefore, we don't have a right to come to the population and say, guys, sorry, everyone has to bear the risk in order that we free the 3 Israeli hostages who were released in this Jibril deal in 1985. Here, even Toisves, who says that we're going to overpay for Pidyon Shvuyim, no, we're not going to overpay in this case because we can't strengthen terror. In other words, what Rabbi Yehuda Gershuni said in 1970 or 71 that we saw last class, now Rabbi Shlomo Goren writes it in an Israeli newspaper, and he therefore says, I'm against these deals. And what happens is that there's a few others in the mid-1980s that write in this regard. But it turns into a debate because there are others who want to defend the Israeli government here. So a good example of this is Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, who's a rabbi in Tel Aviv. His Shalos HaTshuvos is called Aseh L'Charav. And he writes over here in Siman Nun Gimel on volume 7. He says, I read with great interest the article by Rabbi Shlomo Goren from Yud Aleph Sivan Tavshin Mem Hey, and I'd like to disagree with him. What does he say? He says, Rabbi Goren writes that this deal is going to strengthen terror. So, Zuz Far Nechainai, Rabbi Chaim David Halevi says that Rabbi Goren is right. However, I'd like to ask you, do you think the people who did this deal, they didn't understand this simple thing? that you could strengthen terror by releasing these terrorists? Elamai, they knew about it, but they have another factor. So let's hear them. What's their other factor? So the Sar B'Tachon at the time was Yitzchak Rabin, and he said that the government made this decision because they care about the morale of Israeli soldiers. If you remember, Rabbi Yehuda Shabiv in Tavshan Lamed Daled that we saw in the last class, he also spoke about the morale of Israeli soldiers. So Yitzchak Rabin, who was the Sar B'Tachon, he said this as well, that when Israeli soldiers know that if he's going to be captured, we have his back and we're going to be there, so he will fight any battle without fear. If, however, we're going to invoke the din of ein poidim, that we can't overpay, so then soldiers will say, I'd rather retreat because I don't want to fall into captivity. And once you enter that, so now you're going to say, oh, we're releasing terrorists, that's dangerous. Yeah, but having soldiers with low morale who aren't fighting and are retreating is also dangerous. So which danger is greater? I don't know, so I leave it up to Sar B'Tachon, I leave it up to Yitzchak Rabin and the Israeli government to figure it out. And so this is my response to Rabbi Shlomo Goren. As he concludes his tshuva, I don't think that Memshalas Yisrael was poil benigud la'alacha. And the vaday la'achar ha'maisa, ein lahar ve'ein lahar, leave it alone. This was his opinion. Now, interestingly, Rabbi Shlomo Goren himself softened his position. Although he wrote right after the deal, this is no good. In 1996, a little after his passing, the family published a book, but Rabbi Goren himself prepared this book for print. And he took this article in Atzoifa, where he wrote against the deal, and he added a paragraph for the publication in the book. The paragraph concludes as follows. Well, despite everything that I said before, which is no, you're not allowed to do these deals, it could be, he says, that in the case of captives of war, when they were captured while they were doing the shlichus of the country that sent them on a mission, so maybe that's different, and maybe there's a holy obligation to do everything to get them out, and none of the limitations of the Mishnah apply over here, because at the end of the day, they were captured when they were doing the shlichus of the country. And I guess he would also add to this, and all the rules of you're allowed to risk, you're not allowed to risk, you're allowed to put people at risk, suffix sakana, all those rules are also out of the window when we want to free people who went on a shlichus of the country. Really, I showed you last class, Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli already said that after the Yom Kippur War. Rabbi Shlomo Goren does not mention Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli in this regard. I also commented then that we had a clear Maram Rottenburg saying Nishtazoi. In the second class on this subject, Maram Rottenburg had a shaila in where a father sent a son on the shlichus, and he wanted to know, is he obligated to redeem him? What was Maram's answer? To redeem him, he's obligated. You sent him on the shlichus, you need to pay for his pidyon shvuyim. But overpay, no, you don't need to, even though it's a case of shlichus. So I mentioned this then, that for Rabbi Shaul Yisraeli, I'll reiterate it now, that this is a very big chiddush. Rabbi Shlomo Goren added it at the end. So it looks like he kind of softened his position on this matter, and he put this in his Sefer Torah HaMedina that he readied for publication and was ultimately published in 1996. Now I mentioned other rabbis were against this deal, this Jibril deal that happened in 1985. So one of them was Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu. Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu wrote in a journal called Sridim, in which it's a European rabbinic journal, in Shvat of Tavshim Mem Vav, but his letter is dated Chaf of Tavshim Mem Hey. So it's not too long after this deal was done. And he writes his letter to Rabbi Yitzchak Ralbag, who is the head of the religious council in Yerushalayim. Basically what happened was that Yitzchak Ralbag wrote an article defending the deal, just like Rabbi Chaim David Halevi did, Rabbi Ralbag did as well. In summary, what does Rabbi Ralbag write? Pikuach nefesh, pushes off anything, not a problem. You could overpay, no problem there. We're worried about the risk. He says, I don't understand. When it comes to the risk of Israeli lives, we always rely on the government for all security matters. So we're relying on the government for them here, and whatever they want, they could do. And so therefore, he has no problem in halacha. And he concludes his letter saying that he spoke to Rabbi Vadia Yosef, and Rabbi Vadia Yosef said that the deal is permitted, which is also something that we saw in the prior class in the context of Entebbe. He says that he spoke to Rabbi Yosef to Rabbi Vadia Yosef in the mid-1980s. Fine. So Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu writes back to him and says, I received your letter. And he says, I disagree with you. One of the lawyers who's been involved in these negotiations in the 1980s, his name is a fascinating individual. His name was Shmuel Tamir. If you are familiar at all with the Kastner case, in the 1950s in Israel, Shmuel Tamir was the lawyer who was fighting against, who was litigating against essentially the Israeli government during this very famous affair. So a fascinating individual. Shmuel Tamir is one of the representatives on the for the Israeli government in the 1980s on some of the earlier hostage deals that we referenced earlier. And what happened was that during this Jibril deal, he said, this is crazy. We can't do this. And he didn't like the way it was going. So he went to Rabin and he said, I want to resign. And Rabin said, no, if you resign, the whole deal is going to fall apart. So hold your resignation until after the deal happens, which is what happened. So Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu says, no one knows more about hostage negotiations than Shmuel Tamir. And he was involved in this. And he said that he wanted to get out. And he says if deal is a bad deal, no one understands the stuff better than him. This is not pidyon shvuyim. This is schita. How would you translate schita when you're pressured into something? What's the extortion? This is complete extortion, he said. Then he says that the Chaver Knesset, Rafael Eitan, who was once the Ramatkal, he also said that the whole negotiation was done incorrectly. And other mumchim have also said this. And so therefore, there is pidyon shvuyim. There was no mitzvah of pidyon shvuyim here. This is what Mordechai Eliyahu says. And he says, "Ein kama koyim elaharich yehi ratzon sheptuya Hashem yeshuvon uvo utziyim berina." We should come to Eretz Yisrael berina with all captives of the Yidden having been freed. So you see over here, Mordechai Eliyahu and Rabbi Shlomo Goren, at least initially Rabbi Shlomo Goren, against Rabbi Vadia Yosef, Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, Rabbi Yitzchak Ralbag. You see a real debate that's going on now in the 1980s, something you didn't have earlier. This is I gauge a little bit of a change in the temperature in this area in the mid-1980s. Now the Rebbe spoke about this, not right away, but the Rebbe did come back to this topic at the end of 1985, Motzei Zos Chanukah Tov Shem Vav, which is basically exactly 40 years ago from last night. The Rebbe was talking about the security situation in Eretz Yisrael. And the Rebbe said as follows: how are you going to intimidate and prevent a terrorist from doing his activity? If you capture him and you put him in jail, you're not going to do much. You give him everything, you give him everything that he needs. And that's better than what he has by him in the village. And then a little while goes, we exchange him. As has happened in the past, where we exchange hundreds of terrorists for 3 or 4 or 5 Jews. They know this. Why? Here already, in the end of 1985, the Rebbe is saying this is already standard operating procedure. In 1979, the Rebbe was like, hey, this is the first time there's a change. And by now, it's like, this is standard operating procedure. So now the terrorists already know that, number one, circumstances in prison, not too shabby. And number two, I have a get-out card. You're not going to scare them off with this type of policy. Now, obviously, the whole tone over here is against these exchanges on the one hand, but at the same time, let's remember, if you're looking for the Rebbe to say that these deals are asur al pi halacha, you don't find that in this chelak of this sicha. And then, one final time, was Shabbos Parshas Vayeshev Tov Shem Memchas. And what happened here is that the Rebbe spoke about it, but then what happened is that people in Eretz Yisrael took the Sikha, and the editor of Kar Chabad magazine took the Sikha. Either he himself wrote it up or he had someone else write it up, that I'm not sure. And it was submitted to the Rebbe as this is going into next week's Kar Chabad magazine, as a news piece. And so the Rebbe edited it. So we have, this is Mukha from the Rebbe. The Rebbe was talking about various and sundry issues that were going on in Eretz Yisrael at the time, moved from topic to topic. And when it came to security, the Rebbe said as follows: the very disturbing security situation in Israel. There are areas where it is literally dangerous for Jews to be. Jews are being murdered. A number of the people who their job is to ensure this doesn't happen, they're not doing enough. They're not doing enough to capture the terrorists. Kinira, apparently the reason they're not doing enough, if they're going to capture them, the top of them, they're going to have to deal with them, then they're going to have the problem. What's the world going to say? And we want to appear as we're peaceful people, and so therefore we rather not pursue the terrorists. The Rebbe continued, even in instances where the terrorists have already been captured and incarcerated, they've been exchanged. They've been exchanged. Where hundreds have gotten out for a few Jews. Now the Rebbe adds the paragraph that we're used to seeing. If you want to add this and analyze this from a halachic perspective, maybe that's a conversation to have a halachic conversation about these deals. Why? At the end of the day, in the Bnei Yisrael, these captured Jews called each is a full, complete world. And the way I understand this is a complete world, and so therefore we're not intimidated by one for 5,000. That one is Olam Malay. So from a halachic perspective, there's maybe room to consider this. Ulam elu sheichlitu al shichar me'as ha'machablim, those who made the decision to release the captives. Now I'm going to pause here and I'll tell you, when the Rebbe said this, the Rebbe said, they didn't do it because of halacha, they don't care about halacha, they did it for other reasons. That's how the Rebbe said it. Because all the transcripts of the way the Rebbe said it report that, and that's when they wrote into the Rebbe, they wrote it in that way, but the Rebbe changed it. The but is not that they didn't do it because they cared about the halacha, the but changed. How did it change? Loi beiru be'ezet tnam mutar achiluf. They didn't find out, they didn't ascertain under what conditions in halacha is such an exchange permitted. Uve'ezet tnaim aser, and in which conditions is it forbidden? Umushlol, and it should be upgefrekt, like a non-starter, not only from halachic perspective, but afilu mebchina b'tchainis, even from a security perspective. In other words, the Rebbe says they didn't do a halachic analysis, they didn't do halachic, and they didn't do a security analysis. Uchameforsim is well known. A number of the terrorists who were released in these exchanges, nitvesu bepu'ulais chavlanos al yedeim atzmam. They've been captured where they themselves were now. This is not in Tafshal Amates. The Rebbe said, I see it as a reasonable possibility. Now the Rebbe is saying it's already happened. People released have reoffended. And so, what do we have here? What do we have here? It sounds like the Rebbe is picking up on where he started out in 1979, Tafshal Amates. There as well, the Rebbe condemned overall, and that's what's happening here. The Rebbe is talking about it's a matzav b'tchoni mavil in Eretz Yisrael, and it's not acceptable, and we have these problems, and part of the problem is how we deal with terrorists, and part of the problem is the way they're being released, but then at the same time, insists on adding, by the way, halachically there could be a discussion, but there he said, they're not doing it because halacha, they're doing it, they did it because they have the wrong attitude. Here, the change with the way the Rebbe wrote it is, yeah, and halacha there's an avenue. But they didn't do the research to figure out what are the conditions in halacha, and for that matter, for security. Okay, so where does that leave us? So I'm going to give the following summary. Number one, during the 1970s, and definitely during the 1980s, there was a wide-ranging debate and discussion among poskim in America and in Eretz Yisrael about this. It's not a new conversation that people started having in 2008 or whatever, 2010. This is a conversation that's been going on in the 1970s and 80s. There was robust articles that were written on both sides. This issue was very much litigated, number one. Number two, the Rebbe never dedicated a sikha to this topic. A sikha was never dedicated to this topic. Moreover, not only a sikha, when I say a sikha, I mean a complete talk. There are complete talks dedicated to Camp David. There are complete talks dedicated to how the war is being fought incorrectly in Lebanon. And likewise, there are many others. A sikha where the Rebbe dedicates to it. There is no time that I'm familiar with where the Rebbe dedicated an entire sikha to the subject of these, which it's not like, because they didn't happen. They happened. And as the Rebbe says in one of the sikhs, it's Tmid and Kisidron already. It's happening all the time. And yet, there is no sikha, full sikha. Moreover, in the 4 references, in none of them is what I think we would consider a wide-ranging discussion and analysis. The Rebbe seems to move through it rather quickly. On a number of occasions, the Rebbe went out of his way to say that he's not shoylo the fact that there is an avenue in halacha to permit it. And the simplest reading, we can always, bend ourselves into a pretzel. The simplest reading is, despite all the security concerns, and despite the terror threats, and despite all that, the Rebbe still seemed to be saying that maybe there's an avenue in halacha to be matir this. In one instance, the Rebbe used the word oinus, that the Israeli government's in a situation of oinus. Tchilasa b'pshia, but soifa ba'oinus. Soifa ba'oinus means it's inevitable. Like, of course they're going to end up making these types of deals. At the same time, each time you're able to see that Rebbe is frustrated. He's frustrated that this is happening, and lamenting that this is happening. I think it's also fair to say, based on the way it always comes up in the context of another discussion, that the Rebbe, I say this tentatively as a suggestion, but I think we may see it rooted in some of these, some of the quotes. The Rebbe viewed this as a symptom of a larger problem, not as a problem itself. The problem itself was bigger issues of how Israel sees itself in the world, its relationship with the United States, its relationship with the Arab states, its relationship with terrorism, how it combats terrorism, and all of that. And having gone wrong in some of those areas, so now this is one of the symptoms that we need to deal with. Okay, so we'll deal with the symptom, but how much time should we be wasting on the symptoms rather than on the root causes? That may be something that ties in to what's happening over here. And as a result, I think, again, I think it becomes very difficult if someone wants to say about a deal, the Rebbe said it's forbidden. I think that's a problem. To say that the Rebbe said it's permitted, I don't know if I'll say that either. To say that the Rebbe said, halachically you could have a discussion that is permitted, but if you only say that, I also think you're misrepresenting the thing, because that's only one small detail. At the end of the day, the context is the Rebbe is always criticizing these deals and very unhappy about them. So I don't know that I have a one-liner for you. I don't know that I have a one-liner for you. And I know that that's a little frustrating. But that's the best I have. And I think that if you want to have a discussion about the Rebbe's position on this, I don't see another way than just going through pretty much everything that we went through right now. Now I'll say another thing. There are definitely, you saw what Rabbi Volpa did. He learned Pshat. And there are probably ways of doing it, probably more than one way of learning Pshat. We could sit and we could break our heads, we could say, no, that this is the Mahalach, and that's a valid way in Limud HaTorah, and in Paskin Halacha, that's a very valid way. You go through a difficult Rambam where it's not so clear, and you say it. But I'm not, and that's fine. Those people who want to do that, that's fine. I'm just saying it's not, my personality type is not to do that if the information doesn't dictate an automatic type of interpretation, so I'm not going to do that. There are others who may do that, and especially if they're Rabbanim and Moira Ra, and that's their psak, and they're familiar with all the information, they definitely have a right to do that. I'm just going to conclude by saying something that was really, that was the conclusion of the first lesson. The conclusion of the first lesson was that we started out with a din, and the din said no, 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 no. And what we found at the end of the first class was yes, and another yes, and another yes, and basically 9 different ways of saying yes, if I recall correctly. And I think now it's fair to say that that has spilled over into the modern context, into Israel as well, where we start out perhaps with a no, and in fact some Rabbanim, we saw today, said no, especially today, said no. We saw last time as well. But at the end of the day, the power of the yes, that same power of the yes that carried weight in the 16th century, in the 17th, the 15th, 16th, that we spoke about then, seems to have persisted. And seems to have persisted into our own times where, as we saw, both in last class and today, where the yes still has a voice. It still retains a voice, even as it seems so much more complicated and difficult. And Masayim B'Toiv, that the Rebbe said during the Rabbi Hutner case in 1970, that we said in last class, that Kaveh el Hashem, Chazak v'yametz lebecha v'Kaveh el Hashem. Hope, trust in Hashem, hope. And then it says Chazak v'yametz lebecha. What do you need? What do you need Chazak v'yametz lebecha? What do you need to strengthen your heart? Because what happens is your hope. You're like something negative happens. So you have emunah, you have betachin, you have Kaveh el Hashem. But then a day, 2, 3, 4 goes by and you don't see results. So what happens? Teva b'nei Adam is you start hoping, you give up. So that's why you Chazak v'yametz lebecha. That even if you don't see it working, Chazak v'yametz lebecha, to still have a Kaveh el Hashem. That's what the Rebbe touched over there. Even though Rabbi Hutner has been in captivity with the other Jews for so long, and our hoping has not paid off, we're still going to continue hoping. So I'd like to say that we've been hoping for a very long time that this problem go away, that we not have to deal with this problem. But as of now, that hoping hasn't materialized because it's timid and kisidron. But we're not going to be nispal, and even though that hoping has not paid off, we're going to have Kaveh el Hashem, and we're going to have the Chazak v'yametz lebecha, that we shouldn't have to deal with this type of terrorism and other forms of terrorism that cause so much pain, and we shouldn't know of any pain. There should be ach toiv v'chesed tamid kol hayomim. L'chaim.